All right, folks, welcome to episode 6 of the APPA Book Club series. Our guest today is Dr. Ashwini Mokashi, who is spotlighted alongside myself here. Dr. Mokashi is a lecturer of Hindi and a tutor of Marathi at Oxford University's Asian and Middle Eastern Studies. She's also a fellow at the Oxford Center for Hindu Studies. She also serves as an academic counselor at the Academy of Comparative Philosophy and Religion in India. Formerly president of Princeton Research Forum, she's taught at SP Pune University and Evergreen Forum at Princeton. She authored Sapiens and Sthitaprajna, and I'll see if she corrects me on that pronunciation later, originally in 2019 in English, a comparative study of Stoicism and the Bhagavad-Gita. And its Hindi translation, Sapiens and Sthitaprajna, just came out last year in 2024. Her research bridges Indian and Western thought, emphasizing philosophy, language, and cultural exchange. She's been a member of the APPA since 2020 and has also contributed to the APPA Journal. Her philosophical counseling practice is based on her research. I'd like to add that Ashwini was one of the cohort of 14 Indian philosophers who took our first APPA philosophical counseling certification training for Indian philosophers in 2020, after which Bala Ganapati, also known as Bala Devarakonda, went on to present the first Indian International Conference on Philosophical Counseling, which would have been in Delhi, but thanks to the pandemic was conducted online, and after which Bala and others went on to establish the Philosophical Practitioners Association of India, or PPAI, and after which APPA and PPAI went on to co-teach and co-certify APPA and the PPAI's first cohort of Indian philosophical counselors. For all these reasons, and without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Ashwini to the APPA Book Club Series, Episode 6. So Ashwini, first, congratulations on the Hindi version of your book. I
Thank
imagine
you.
you must be very happy to share your work in Hindi.
Yeah,
Can,
let me
can you
just show it to you
tell us a little
here.
bit about that? Perhaps how is the book being received in Hindi? Any feedback in Hindi that you might have received?
So far, the feedback has only come in sort of anecdotally. So far, it's been positive, and I guess the Hindi book was created or the book was translated because there was some demand for it. So, as far as I know, it's positive, but then it's only a small
Yes,
population,
of
so I
course.
haven't heard much about it.
Yeah.
And then, it also remains to be seen if you're sort of reaching the right kind of audience, if you're reaching like, people who speak Hindi and who read Hindi, because that population is not always in the urban areas. So it can be difficult to reach them.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure that it brings you some personal gratification to have it translated into any Indian language, what with your
Yeah, that part is true.
ethnicity.
I mean, I'm very fond of Indian languages. I'm a big supporter of them, and I think they need to be spoken. They need to reach out, and for some reason, like there's some hesitancy in speaking or using Indian languages, mostly because it's very important for Indian people to know English to be able to get jobs. And so everybody, even if they know broken English, need to learn English. And then it becomes very difficult for a lot of people to switch between languages and stuff. So the new generation I see learning more and more English and less their own language, even if they speak the language at home. And I'm just, sort of like making very general statements. So I'm not saying that it's 100% true, but it's sort of increasingly more true.
Yeah, I would imagine as part of so many cultural changes going on in contemporary India right now.
Yeah, true. And if the jobs require you to understand English, then you can't really escape that. And then it becomes like a matter of like, how can I also keep other languages in good shape?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, in terms of only anecdotal feedback, I remember when I was on the cusp of either going to graduate school for philosophy or law school, one of my philosophy professor mentors told me, Rick, it's a very monastic and lonely life, the life of a philosopher. And you're going to look forward to your first publication, and you'll be lucky if a few of your friends read it.
Yeah,
Not everybody's as lucky as Lou Marinoff over here, who's got his books translated in many languages.
true, true,
All
true.
right, so tell us a little bit more about you. First of all, I didn't prepare you for this, but it came to my mind that I really should ask you. Congratulations on being at Oxford.
Oh, thank
That's
you.
number one. I'm curious how you got there, but also how you came to philosophy, how you came to philosophical counseling, and how you wound up at Oxford.
Yeah, a lot of questions.
Yeah,
And
take your time and answer them in any way you prefer.
yeah, well, also thank you for inviting me here. And it's really lovely to see all the familiar faces, or at least some of them. And I'm really glad to be back on this platform again. I should also mention that the Hindi book was published by MB Publishing House, and one of her colleagues, Charu Thaplial, works there. She was also one of the 14 people from Indian philosophy group. So she was very crucial and central in this enterprise as well. So how did I come to philosophy? I guess it was probably my destiny to come to philosophy. I had a lot of background, in philosophy from my family side. Like my family had a spiritual connection with a group which is headed by a very famous philosopher in India. And so my grandfather, who was a very good friend of him, always, sort of read books in philosophy with his friends. And
Who
sometimes
was this? Who was this individual?
this person was known as Professor R.D. Ranade, or also known as Gurudev R.D. Ranade. And this is one of his books that I want to point out. And this is his picture at the back.
Right.
He was also a vice chancellor of Allahabad University for many years, and he also headed a group called Adhyatma Vidyapith in Nimbar in Karnataka. And in fact, my current research is on his philosophy. He was a very prolific writer. Anyway, my grandfather was closely connected to him. My grandfather was also his disciple. And I grew up with my grandparents. And so I was, sort of preview to all their discussions with their friends on philosophy and spirituality. And so it was like, sort of a very familiar thing for me. And then when I grew up and needed to figure out where to go for college, I sort of had two options, either to do medicine or do philosophy. And my father was not keen on any of those options. He wanted me to go into business. So we kind of made a deal that as long as I make sure that I have some source of income, or I'm, earning good money, I can also do philosophy. So as a result, I actually started my first business at the age of 19, around the time when I also started doing philosophy very seriously. And then in college, I started reading Republic for the first time, for the first year. And that just sealed the deal. It's like after reading Plato's Republic, I wanted to do nothing else. And then I also read some Greek language, although it wasn't possible to do that in India. And I also got a degree in Sanskrit. So I kind of developed multiple things in those years, like languages, philosophy, and also some business skills and stuff. And for the longest time, I continued that. In fact, when I lived in the US for 10 years, I was working in the corporate world. And 1 year, I was working downtown Manhattan as an executive compensation manager at American Express. So it sort of like has been a lot of juggling different balls. Anyway, so the way Sapiens and Sthitaprajna came about was when I was a student in London of Greek language and Greek philosophy. I used to go to some lectures which is on Stoic philosophy. And somehow, whenever I would listen to Stoicism, I felt like I was listening to Indian philosophy, and I couldn't figure out why, because it's not like until then I had studied Indian philosophy as such very, thoroughly. I had taken some courses and I'd read Sanskrit, but I wasn't a student of Indian philosophy at the time. I was a student of analytical philosophy, so it's more into the Western philosophical world. But after I finished studying in London, I was only there for a year. I went back and I wanted to pursue this thought further. And then I realized that, a lot of the information was coming from the Bhagavad-Gita that I thought was very relevant with Stoic principles. And so I studied the Gita in Sanskrit and I started studying Indian philosophy as well. And then instead of doing a PhD in Plato, which I had originally intended to do, I got really absorbed with this sort of comparative philosophy. But it wasn't a thing to do in those days, so I didn't have the right kind of support, and it took me a very long time. It took me 10 years to finish my research, and every year I would say, okay, this is just 6 more months. I know my ideas. They're very clear in my head. I need to write them down. And then I would realize, okay, I don't have enough references. Or, I haven't really thought this through. I haven't thought that through. And it became a very long journey, far longer than I expected. But I think it was all well worth it. And finally, by the time I finished working on it, I actually had no confidence that it was worth doing it. I mean, I started off with a lot of confidence that I knew what I was thinking. And by the time I ended the work, I realized that this was such a huge enterprise that I was lucky that I even managed to scratch the surface of it. So philosophical counseling, how did it come to it? That was another sort of, serendipity, I would say. So when I was working on these concepts, and, a lot of Stoic or concepts from Gita talk about detachment and how one has to be detached from, sort of emotional ups and downs, or detached from the optics of desire. Like if you like chocolate, you can't just keep eating it. If you like ice cream, you can't just every day sort of think about eating ice cream or do that all the time. So those concepts didn't make any sense to me in my days of studying on these principles. So I decided that I'm going to use my friends as guinea pigs and try and apply those concepts to see if what I'm studying really, makes any sense to us, or was it true only for the ancient times when people were somehow different, that they were more disciplined, more, sort of in control of their desires or what have you. So we started these experiments. And before that, once I had this opportunity that I was invited to give a talk on Indian philosophy at a girls' detention center in Pune. And I just went there because I wanted to see what a center looks like from inside. And I told them about Indian philosophy and our history and culture. And then I wanted to know what they thought about it. And then when they told me their stories, the stories were so extremely negative and threatening. So I felt terrible about it. And I said, look, you can look at it this way. And, try to sort of change their views and give them some positive stories to think about, which are, again, part of the Indian philosophical tradition. And somehow they really seriously cheered up. So the authorities there asked me if I could come back again to tell them more stories. So I said, sure. I mean, it seemed like fun. So I kept going there, and every time I would go there, I would receive such a great feedback that they would want me to come back again, and I felt like going back again. So it kind of continued for some time. So I would think like that was really, in some ways, a group philosophical counseling, because I was telling them philosophical stories, or I was training them to think of their stories differently, instead of reaching the most negative or horrible conclusions, see what's good in their story. So I think it was those two incidents where, using my friends as guinea pigs and talking at this detention center, that kind of, gave birth to my practice. And after that, every time I give a talk on my research, and I just enjoyed doing that, people would come to me and say, could you help us solve this or solve that? Or what would you, how would you sort of, create a perspective about that. Is there any sort of support in the Gita or in Stoic philosophy? And then we would just sort of work on those problems together. And I kept getting more and more interesting and complex problems. I mean, one of my, I guess, most fun problem that I worked on was somebody who came from Europe and completely believed in the philosophy of Sartre, and then later in life went towards Indian philosophy and wanted to sort of see the results of Vedanta philosophy, but coming from Satrian background. And I thought that was like impossible desire, because it's like if you're sort of big believer in Satrian philosophy, you're going to get the results of Satrian philosophy. How could you get results of Vedanta philosophy? And this person said, but now I believe in Vedanta philosophy. So I said, okay, then you have to start from the basics. It doesn't just sort of transfer itself. So things like that. And then then I also did a lot of social work for some time. So it was very useful in that regard as well. And finally, when I published the book, I really published it from the point of view of philosophical counseling. And that's not exactly the word I used to use or the term. I probably just said how to put it into practice. But I wanted my clients to know that whatever I'm telling them is based on my research or on these philosophies, and here's my research, so that my work or my thinking is very transparent. So I guess that's how it came about.
That's a really great story. Wow. Thank you for
Thank
giving
you.
so many rich details. Part of it with the detention center, you remind me of Vana. I wish she was here today to hear this, but
Yeah,
she can
yeah,
watch
I
the
used to talk to her.
recording.
Yeah,
Yeah, she can
I
watch
talked
the
to her about
recording. Oh,
it.
so she knows about your history. Okay,
Yeah,
cool.
yeah, and she
Yeah.
did a lot of work with the prison
Yeah,
folks.
yeah. For folks who don't know Vana, she's one of the APPA VPs, and she's done a lot of institutional counseling work. Yeah. So that was that reference. All right. So how about Oxford? I know you were at
Um,
Princeton, and these are all great names on your CV here, Ashwini.
well,
Princeton, Oxford. Tell us
okay,
about Oxford.
I had to thank my husband for that. I had nothing to do to gain that kind of, a reputation. But he was a professor at Princeton, and so when I married him, we moved to Princeton, and then he decided to move to Oxford at some point. So uh, our family moved to Oxford. And then after coming here, I got very lucky. There was this job available for Hindi teaching, and I applied for it mostly on the basis that I write a lot of articles on philosophical counseling also in Hindi, and and the basis for that is a work of Saint Kabir. So after doing the work on the ancient philosophy of the Bhagavad-Gita and Stoic philosophy, I thought, why not also think about medieval philosophers? And in India, the medieval philosophers were really the saints from the Bhakti culture. So then I started working on Saint Kabir and Saint Tukaram from Maharashtra. So Kabir is from northern India, and he writes in Braj Bhasha, which is the Archaic Hindi. So I was writing a lot of articles in English, Hindi, and Marathi. I would translate them in multiple languages, or sometimes I would just write. I would just write in any one of those languages and translate them. So that became very helpful, and so I got the job of teaching Hindi, and it's only a part-time job, but it's sort of very helpful.
Oh, it's great. You know, it's interesting to me how so many people in our space have similar stories about this part of their life that winds up being beneficial in this other place. Things come
Yeah,
together. What does Lou tell me when I tell him, "Oh, how fortunate?" He says, "That's not fortune, it's karma."
yeah, yeah,
It's good
something like
karma.
that.
It's your
Yeah.
good karma. All right, so the book is about primarily not just Stoicism, but Seneca. He's like the main Stoic that you discuss, and the Gita. So, I'm sure there are some people who might not have read either. First, tell us about the Bhagavad Gita.
Okay, so Bhagavad Gita is a very, very short text. and it is like, this, it's like just this size. Can you see how small it is?
Yes. Yeah.
It's like 19 chapters, and it's all in the verse form, and it's really supposed to be the sort of like the summary of the Vedas and the Upanishads. And it's a part of the epic Mahabharata. And Mahabharata is all about this big war. And this text was narrated by Sri Krishna, who is the incarnation of Lord Vishnu, in the battlefield to Arjuna, who was the prince and the main warrior of the Pandav army. So it seems impossible that somebody would just narrate a philosophical text in the middle of the battlefield, but it actually makes a lot of sense given what the contents are, and the text sort of is regarded as also separate from the entire epic, because the entire epic is not religious. It's sort of a it's an epic, and the text of the Bhagavad-Gita is also considered to be a religious and spiritual text. So people look at it differently, and many followers of the Gita, if they're spiritual followers, they'll only believe in the spiritual aspect of it. If they're religious followers, they are sort of devout religious people. So for me to talk about the Gita was a bit risky, because I was talking about it from the point of view of scholarship, and in a way that's comparative, that I was trying to say, okay, the philosophy can be compared with other philosophies of other world, which are not religious philosophies. I mean, you can say that Stoicism had a major influence on Christianity, and that is also true, but at the time when it is Stoic philosophy, it is not considered religious as such. So sometimes initially, now it's become now the Stoic philosophy, or this kind of comparison, is become such a common thing that sometimes when I talk to people, they say to me, oh, I was just thinking about it. This is what I came up with by reading it. And I said, okay, that's great. I mean, the fact that it's become such commonplace, I think is a major victory of works like these. But this wasn't commonplace. And in fact, when I was trying to find a supervisor, there wasn't a single person who could guide me. So I really had a team of 6 different philosophers, both from Indian world and from the Western philosophy world. And I had to convince each one of them to talk to me or to hear me out and, help me clear my ideas. But anyway, so the Gita is such an unusual text. And the second chapter of the Gita is supposed to be the karma of it's the yoga of karma, or it's the chapter on action. And I only focus on the 19 verses in that chapter. There are about 72 or 74 verses, and it's a very short description of the ideal sage, or Sthitaprajna. So Sthitaprajna is how it would be pronounced in English, I suppose, because of the way it's spelled. In Sanskrit, it's pronounced as Sthitaprajna, and in Hindi, it's pronounced as Sthitaprajna. So both those pronunciations, or probably even 3, are acceptable.
I know the prajna or prajna is a popular word also in Buddhism for wisdom. So a number of us here recognize that. But the sthiti part, this has something to do with being established, right?
Right, or stable. Yeah, it talks about Sthitaprajna means somebody who has a stable intelligence, or somebody who's established in wisdom. So you're very close. And this is the ideal person in the second chapter, and the same ideal person somehow continues in other chapters and becomes expert in yoga, expert in bhakti, expert in jnana, expert in moksha. And the person who is denoted by the Gita is Lord Krishna himself, or incarnation of Lord Vishnu. So he is this giant figure who cannot be compared with anyone. And so I wasn't really comparing Sri Krishna with Seneca, far from it, but I was comparing the concept of Sthitaprajna with the concept of sapiens. And then Sapiens is the ideal person of the Stoics. And the Stoics follow Socrates and Plato. They're not really followers of Aristotle, you know. So it's one branch of Plato that developed after a big gap in the years. And so for them, the exhibit A of Sapiens is really Socrates.
Yeah.
So it's interesting, like, you know, how they are describing this ideal person or the characteristics of this person, but they only can produce one example, which is of Socrates. So if you ask Zeno, who was the founder of Stoicism, are you a wise person, or Seneca, they would say, like, we are on the path of being wise, but we are not there yet, because it's the kind of person who never does anything wrong. Like, you know, he has to be right at all times. So it's
Ideal.
really, yeah, ideal. And if you look at the entire Stoic philosophy, and if you're, let's say, a professor of Stoicism, you wouldn't explain Stoicism the way I explain Stoicism, because I was more focused on, like, you know, what are the parallels in them? What are the differences and what are the similarities? And I found a lot of similarities. And since my focus was in comparison, I talk more about, like, you know, those threats. And then obviously the differences exist too, and the differences are probably very obvious to everyone, that, you know, one is a religious text, the other is a philosophical text. Gita is written in prose. Seneca writes in, you know, in sort of a regular, like almost like a novel kind of a language. I mean, his writings are philosophical, but they're not as deeply philosophical as Platonic dialogues or Aristotelian works of philosophy. And he's supposed to have influenced Shakespeare quite a lot in writing. So he was somewhere in between, you know, he was neither a very deep philosopher nor a novelist, but he combined sort of, you know, the virtues of all of them. And sometimes he also appears to be, like, not as serious or intense. He has a lot of imagination there as well. And some of those imaginative texts from Seneca do talk about afterlife. And they sort of, like, you know, leave it at that, like, oh, I wonder what it might be like. But it doesn't develop those, those thoughts anymore. So the major reason to select Seneca was simply because a lot of texts were available from Seneca, and everything else was not either satisfactory or not available. Like, if you look at Epictetus, for example, his writing is so compact and so short. I mean, I love that because it gives you exactly the knowledge or information that you need, but it doesn't dwell much. He doesn't expand that, and that was a problem with that. Marcus Aurelius writes beautifully as well, but somehow the descriptions of sapiens were far more available in the writings of Seneca. Yeah, so those were really the reasons to choose them.
Very good. All right. So why don't you share with, let me just remark about a couple of things that you said. One, yes, Stoicism is on the rise again in popular
Yeah.
contemporary culture, at least in the West. So that's very fortuitous for you and for your book. But another thing that you said was how difficult it was for you to get people on your committee to approve your topic. I had a similar experience writing on free will at the CUNY Graduate Center for my PhD. My professors who loved me were so disappointed that I wanted to write on metaphysics, free will. They didn't believe there was such a thing or that it was even philosophically interested, because they were all analytic philosophers, which you have experience with, and all they cared about was philosophy of language, philosophy of logic, philosophy of science. They didn't care about free will. But by the time I got my dissertation published, which I also took about a decade through meandering and all sorts of problems, free will was now a huge topic again in philosophy. That's just the way these things work out.
Yeah.
So I resonated with some of your story once again.
I'm glad to hear that.
Pardon me?
Very glad to hear that. Hear your
Yes. Yeah.
story.
All right. So that's a pretty decent overview of why the Gita and Seneca, why you put those two together. So you want to say a little bit more about the commonalities between the Sthitaprajna and the Sapiens?
Sure. I guess the major commonality between the two of them, which I like to talk about quite often, is a concept of detachment. And this is one concept I think is like very hard for people to understand, and it was for me as well, because how do you detach to actually accomplish something? I mean, if you detach, then it's like you're separating, and then that thing is gone, like what you're trying to accomplish. But in a very interesting way, detachment and attachment sort of have to go together. Once I wrote a piece, an article on marriage, and I felt like, I was trying to say that, okay, one gets married or one gets into a relationship because of attachment, but one maintains that relationship due to detachment. It's like, if you don't allow any detachment, then the relationship doesn't survive. And this just like, I mean, I got more hate mail at that time than
Oh
admiration.
no.
So I think that is true both in the Gita and in Stoicism. Like Stoicism calls it apatheya, and the Gita calls it anasakti. And there's another word which is used for the monks, let's say, monks who follow
Aragya?
Vedanta philosophy. Yeah, Vairagya. And Vairagya is sort of like, similar concept, but at a sort of distant from an asakti. So this asakti, which is havyas or attachment or greed, and then this anasakti, which is like, which is not asakti. So they are not saying it's vairagya. Gita doesn't say like, renunciation is important for everybody. They are saying that you have to learn to detach from whatever the objects of your desire are. And that's the only way sort of like, you're going to make progress or be able to take good decisions. Like their entire focus is on wisdom and virtue. So both for Sapiens and Sthitaprajna, the major goal is to have the knowledge of what is right and to be able to implement that knowledge, which is virtue according to them. And that is going to result into happiness for both of them. So this is almost like a mantra, like you need to know what's right, you need to be able to do what's right, and then what results is happiness. And also their ideas of happiness were such which were also very, very sort of like, not conventional ideas of happiness. And they were very profound, and they both propounded the same theory. So happiness meant for the Gita, that you're productive, that you're doing something, and whatever you're doing is kaushalam, with skill. So you are doing your karma and you're doing it with dharma, which is like you're doing your duty, you're doing it according to the rules, and you're doing it sakushalam, like with skill. And that is, that's what results into happiness. And another small quip there is that you keep doing your work, but you don't expect any fruits. So whatever fruits you get are what you're supposed to get. So if you if you sort of like, apply for a job because you want to have the best job you could get, and you want at least X amount of money, you may not get it. But if you apply for a job with the intention of making a difference, that, doing that job successfully and as well as you could, then you'll both get the job and get the money. So that's the message that the Gita is trying to tell you. And likewise, Stoics also have a concept of virtue, which is largely based on Platonic philosophy. And they expect that the person follows these virtues in their day-to-day behavior. But how do they know whether they are doing virtuous things or not? So for that, they need to have the knowledge, which is a wisdom of, what is right and what is wrong. what is virtue and what is not. So is courage, actually a point of courage in some situation, or it could also be a risk. It could be not courageous in the sort of perspective of some other people. So it's a combination of all those things. Like, how do you know X to be X and not Y? Okay, so those were sort of like the major themes, I would say, like being virtuous, being wisdom, being wise, and being happy. Then there was another, talk about equanimity, like how you had to stay equanimous from pleasure and pain and from losses and gains. That is also a very, very difficult thing to do. And yeah, and I would probably say that those are the major similarities.
One similarity that you sort of touched on, but not in the language that I'm about to use, is about karma yoga, the spiritual path or philosophy of actions performed for the right reason without expectation of the reward. In the Gita, it's kind of very close to the Stoic idea of the dichotomy of control. And you mentioned this in your book, preferred, indifferent, right?
Right,
Preferred, indifferent.
right.
So these are my
Yeah,
orientations, my motivation. I have to have attachment on
yeah,
some level in order to motivate
yeah,
myself to do anything. But it's a Kantian idea too, that you want to do the right thing because it's right. So you have these orientations, but you're free from the result. And the Stoics, if you
yeah,
get the result that you want, that's great. If you don't get the result that you
yeah,
want, that's okay. So this is one
true.
of the main popular ideas. If people learn almost anything about Stoicism, they learn about the dichotomy of control. You
Yeah,
want to become a perfect archer. Once the arrow released from the bow, the wind might knock it out of the way. That's okay. As long as you, as an
yeah,
agent, are doing what you're supposed to do, don't worry about the results. Yeah.
yeah.
So,
Yeah, I totally agree. In fact, the idea of indifference is another very exciting part of Stoic philosophy. And I enjoy talking about that as well, because it's the preferred indifference, which are like, they say the beauty or wealth are preferred indifference. And how could you not want to have those? But they're still indifferent. They are not your goal. They are not your, target.
yeah.
Likewise, poverty and ugliness or not being hygienic, those are negative indifference. Like they're not good. I mean, nobody wants them. But at the same time, if you happen to have them even for a short period of time, that shouldn't really affect your, decision making or your understanding of right and wrong. And that shouldn't be the cause for your depression. So
One
these
of the,
was,
I'm sorry.
yeah,
Go ahead.
no, go ahead.
One of the important differences on the side of the Gita is that teaching might be easier psychologically to follow if you believe what Krishna says about karma in the
Yeah,
Gita. That
yeah,
whatever happens to you is your karma anyway. It all
yeah.
works out. It's a just world theory that Krishna is presenting. Everything is always going to work out ultimately.
Yeah, yeah,
All
true.
roads lead back to me, he says, right? So,
Yeah, yeah, true.
yeah, so the Stoics don't have that kind of religious reassurance. Although I know some Stoics back then anyway had a kind of religious view of the logos, and part of that idea got taken up in Neoplatonism, which influenced Christianity, like you mentioned. So it's all fascinating stuff. Really brilliant book.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thanks a
we only
lot.
have a few minutes before we open it up to the audience. You know that I have a personal interest in meditation, and I know the Gita advises that as one of the main paths. And also, the Stoics had various forms of meditation. So, could you speak to any parallels between those two things? I think both. both philosophies kind of elevate the importance of this kind of contemplative, introspective, mindful approach to life, so, and practices that will cultivate that. And you mentioned mantras, like that, these key Stoic ideas were almost like mantras. Well, the Stoics also would repeat affirmations like mantras, that they would conjure them up in appropriate moments, and they would meditate on them to kind of sink them into their memory. That's, I'll just throw that out there. You say what you want in
Yeah,
response. And then
yeah.
I have one more question for you before we turn it open to the audience.
Thank you. And you're quite on target. So one way to describe it is like, we say in Sanskrit that Chintan, Manan, sadhan are the ways of doing meditation. I mean, there's of course the mantra meditation where you repeat the same mantra, with a focus on an object or by closing your eyes. This chintan, which is like, thinking about it, doing introspection. Well, manan comes close to introspection, but it's like, thinking about something is also meditation. Introspection is also meditation. So,
Like
so
in Vedanta,
yeah, we
Vedanta,
don't,
self-inquiry, all that stuff. Yeah.
right, right. So you find that in Plato too about self-inquiry, right? Like know thyself. But I think Stoics don't actually talk about meditation as such in terms of like, sitting down and doing mantra meditation or just sitting down and thinking with closed eyes or something. So that never occurred to them, as far as I can tell. But Chintan and Manan, like thinking, introspecting, or discussing, those were all the forms that they had suggested. So when I gave a talk at the Bhandarkar Institute, somebody asked me a similar question, and when I told them that meditation, as such, was not a practice among Stoics, and they found it very, very surprising. Like they thought without meditation, you can't really go towards introspection or just thinking or purification of mind, so to say.
Yeah, well, I don't think they had the concept of sitting in Padmasana, with eyes
Yeah,
closed. But I think
yeah,
that some of the contemplative exercises that they encourage count as forms of meditation.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so, like even the three disciplines of desire, action, and assent, right? I mean, you need to cultivate introspective, contemplative ability to just even engage in those three disciplines, but not sitting with your eyes closed necessarily.
Mhm.
All right.
I
So
agree.
I was, if we had more time, I would have asked you to explain those three disciplines, but I don't think it's important. But you can. But the last question from me to you is, because you already answered the question why you wrote the book. Anything else you'd like to share before we turn it over to Q&A?
I guess if I can, take the liberty and share my more recent work, which I also produce videos about, and it's all sort of, inspired through philosophical counseling. And some of those topics used to come up in my practice, and I felt that, more than the Gita or Stoics or the ancient philosophers, the Bhakti saints had good answers because, we have stories from that period and how they dealt with it and how they applied it. And, in India, like just until 100 years ago, everybody went to philosophers to ask for advice or help. So these were the heroes of that time. And so my work on Saint Kabir is called Kabiriyat, and it's on my blog. The articles are on my blog, and the videos are also on my blog. And we are starting a new series on Saint Tukaram from Maharashtra, and that is also coming up. So the video has come up, and the articles are still going to be
I
uploaded.
look forward to that. I have a friend named Tukaram who lives in India now also. He's
Okay,
an American yogi guy,
okay.
lives in Tiruvannamalai near, where Ramana Maharshi hung out, all that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's a very popular name.
Yeah. All right. So let me change the view momentarily to the gallery view. And then see, I know Mike put a question in the chat, so maybe we'll go with him first. Mike, you want to read that out loud, or would you like me to read it?
Let
Me.
me
Has your philosophical practice given you a sense of emotional equilibrium or equanimity?
That is a great question, and it comes up many times. And again, you'll get different answers if you ask my family, and I'll give you a different answer perhaps. But yes, absolutely. I mean, I can tell you that without this book, or like just doing this practice or something, I think life would have looked very different, and then it would have been just running from one counselor to another counselor. So it definitely gives you, and again, like when you're in the moment of crisis, it's very difficult to have that self-talk. Self-talk is much easier when there is no crisis and you're just doing introspection or thinking about possibilities. In the moment of crisis, I remember my father would tell me sometimes, and so would my husband, like, just go read your book. You got all the answers there. And I used to feel sometimes that they were making mockery of my work, but it was actually true. I mean, the answers are given there.
Physician, heal thyself, right?
Right,
I
right.
think one of the leading Stoics, one of the first followers of Socrates, was it Chrysippus? I forget the name, who said that for him, this Stoicism was internalizing the philosophy of Socrates, which is this dialectic within himself, asking himself the kind of questions that he would have asked Socrates, engaging in that himself. So yeah, it's hard. What is the Solomon paradox? Are you familiar with the Solomon effect? Rather, we're all very good at giving others advice, but not at taking it ourselves or seeing how to
Yeah,
apply our wisdom to our own case. Well,
yeah, yeah,
practice makes
true.
perfect.
So I think you have to have these principles and beliefs well established in you before you run into a crisis. And then it's much easier because the crisis really tests that. And it also tests whether your beliefs are really authentic, sincere, or you just sort of nod your head.
Yeah, and this reminds me of meditation with Stoicism. All right, so it depends on what you call meditation. If you think the Yoga Sutra's idea of stopping thought counts only as real meditation, then you won't see these other things that involve thought as meditation, right? And many people have that model as what meditation is, and these other things are contemplation, etc. But I forget which Stoic it was, but there is a Stoic meditation practice called premeditatio malorum. So, thinking in advance in the morning of some event that might go wrong, like you don't get the job at the interview or something like that, and then imagining a wise way to respond to it. And then post at the end of the day, reflecting and reviewing the day, seeing anything that you did that was suboptimal, and imagining counterfactually better ways that you could have responded. This is this kind of rehearsing and reviewing. It's a meditative practice, but it involves lots of thinking and visualizing and all of that. And that kind of activity creates the muscle memory in your brain so that when a certain kind of crisis happens, if you're a stoic and you've been working with affirmations, you'll think of the insight that's helpful, which is maybe the arrow is out of my bow, I can't control the outcome.
Yeah,
That kind of
yeah,
insight functions like a mantra if you
yeah, I
practice with that
agree.
sort of thing. Yeah.
Yeah. Also, another thing is like when you spend your time with, like I spent a good amount of time with the EMS, like Emergency Medical Services in New Jersey, or like visiting the detention center or something, and then you see sort of like the how low life can get for people sometimes. That also helps you really develop this perspective. And sometimes when I would have chats with these patients, I would like talk to them about detachment or these ideas and say like if you had just sort of if you just sort of thought it through, or if you had the patience to think things through, you probably wouldn't have had a drug overdose or something like that.
Yeah.
So it's all a matter of perspective and relative importance because everybody has crisis in their life. I
Yeah.
think it's another question.
Sarah is next, but I just want to answer Michelle's question. She said, what was the name of the morning practice? Premeditatio, P-R-E, like meditation without the N at the end, and malorum, which means negative or bad, like malevolent, as that root. And I guess the other one would be post meditatio, malorum. Sarah, unmute yourself, please.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I was wondering if you could say more about in what way you think that Christianity is influenced by Stoicism, because I myself have had spiritual direction with a Jesuit priest, and I see a tension between the detachment of Stoicism and Christianity.
Sorry, can I interrupt? I can't hear you very well.
Maybe get closer
That's
to your microphone.
I'll try to fix that.
Okay.
What she was saying while she's working on that was this connection between Stoicism and Christianity. She's a little confused by that because she's had some kind of pastoral counseling from a Jesuit, but there seems to be some kind of inconsistency there. I'm not sure what. Sarah, you want to specify that now?
How's this?
Much
Yeah,
better.
much better.
Yeah. So I was saying that my Jesuit priest said that God works through our desires. That's one reason why we pray. God God is influenced by our desires and His plan for us. And it seems to me there's a tension between asking yourself what your desires are and praying for them, communicating them to God, and the idea that God works through your desires. There's a tension between that and the detachment of Stoicism.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay, I'm not familiar with the Jesuit counseling, so I can only try and guess what what the situation might be. But even in the in Indian philosophy, like we do believe that the fatalism aspect, that there's a design, a divine design, and all of us are sort of falling through that, and then our desires will lead us to the goal that we have. But detachment comes in the sense that one doesn't get too attached to what we are seeking. So if your goal is to have five, and this is a very nonsensical example, forgive me for that, but if your goal is to eat 5 kgs of ice cream by the end of the today to give you so much happiness, which one cone of ice cream wouldn't give you, then you need to be detached from that and think, like, is that really a good thing? Is that going to actually help you? Is that healthy, unhealthy?
Yeah, well, of course, I guess we're talking, maybe we're using desire in two different senses. When I was when the spiritual director talked about what God how God works through our desires, I think he was thinking more in terms of what one wants to do instead of what one wants to have.
You know what
Right.
I would say, if I
Yeah.
may, Sarah? There are multiple forms of Christian philosophy. You know, there's Calvinism. There's so many. Some that don't believe in free will. Some think it's all destined. It's all God's will. Some who insist that it doesn't make sense if we don't actually have free will. So this idea that God is somehow or another behind our desires, well, certainly that's problematic because we have a lot of vicious desires as well. So I don't see how the mere general claim that Stoicism influenced Christianity is going to solve this confusion about this Jesuit idea of the one that you brought to the table. I'm not so sure that this is
Can you
a
say?
problem for Stoicism, is what I would
Well,
say.
I'm wondering I'm wondering In what precise way Stoicism, you think that Stoicism did influence Christianity?
Oh, well, that's an easier question. Ashwini, do you want to say a little bit about that?
No, I
Or
would like to
no?
do that.
Oh, you'll pass on that? All right. Well, maybe Lou wants to answer that. But before, is that what you wanted to answer, Lou? Or
Yeah,
otherwise, I could.
I
Oh,
couldn't resist.
okay. So let's bring Lou in to answer that. Better
But
you
then,
than me, Lou.
maybe Rick, but I just couldn't resist jumping in because if you're invoking the Jesuit version of things, then you have to be assuming original sin, and then there's a lot of interesting philosophical problems associated, theodicy, and a lot of other things associated. We have to get some interpretations to explain those things away, but nonetheless, it just seems to me, Ashwini and Rick, that there is a kind of parallel one could make, and it's not too forced. If you think about the problem of desire from, let's say, a Christian point of view, that we're afflicted with it as part of our original sin, and we have to overcome it. But in the Gita, Lord Sri Krishna says that desire is our worst enemy, and it has to be slain.
Yeah.
So, I mean, in that sense, one could see a kind of convergence of views there. They're not going to have the same method for resolving the problem, but they're both seeing desire as being something that works against us, but that we're still prepossessed with it. Yes?
Well,
Yeah.
what I think is that you have to account for the purpose of prayer. I mean, the purpose of prayer for a Christian isn't simply free me from free me from temptations. It's also uh, guide me in getting the desires for the things that I have that are valuable.
Well, prayer is such a broad concept and it's universal. It's not restricted to Christianity. And there are at the very least, two general categories of prayer. One is
Petitionary prayer.
petitionary, I want this, I want that, please don't do this, don't let that happen. And the other is, please draw me closer to you, God. Evolve me morally and spiritually. Those are, or for the world, altruistic prayer like loving kindness, meditation.
Yeah.
So this is a very complicated thing. There are there's a whole discipline of desire. The three main yogas in Stoicism are the discipline of desire, the discipline of assent, and what's the other one? Of views, beliefs, right? I forget what the word is, but paying attention to your beliefs, that's like right view, first step in Buddhism, and then right intention in Buddhism, that's the discipline of desire, and then right action, that's karma yoga. So there's a lot of convergence between Stoicism and the Gita, but all those things occur in the monotheistic religions. And Christianity is an outgrowth of Judaism, so is Islam, and they have a lot of these parallels. But look, the serenity prayer is the most obvious way in which Stoicism influenced Christianity. The serenity prayer. That's the dichotomy of control. God grant me, the wisdom to know the difference between the things I can and can't control and the courage to try to change the things that I can. Right? This is a primary idea in Stoicism, and that's a Christian idea.
Right.
That came out of Stoicism.
And
I don't see that. I don't think that idea is in tension with Christianity,
No,
but I
it's
don't
not.
see it. But I don't see it as explicitly in the Bible. And I also would add that I think that there's an overlap between petitionary prayer and draw me closer to you, God.
Yeah, if it's altruistic, if you're a bodhisattva-oriented Buddhist, you want to grow spiritually so that you could help everybody better, not for your own sake. It depends. But you know what? I think all of this is moving away from, I think we've gone enough outside of the sphere of the Gita and Seneca here. So let's see who else has a hand up now. Patricia Murphy, let's get you in here.
Thank you. I had a couple of questions and thoughts. I've been doing a lot with Epictetus recently, and most recently, I guess it was Central APA. I was given a talk about the frequency with No, it wasn't. It was New York APA. The frequency with which he tells us to remember. There are 53 passages in the Enchiridion, and in 26 of them, he has big as life. Remember, which to me seems like a kind of meditation that he is recommending. Remember what is up to you and what is not up to you. Whatever situation you encounter, expect reality, not what you desire to have happen. I just thought that was very interesting. And then the other thing was Old Father's translation of the discourses. He mentions that the word freedom is mentioned in the discourses 130 times, and Epictetus is really very, very clear about freedom, and it is the freedom to deliberate about our situation and make a decision, so those just both kind of seemed a lot like counsels of meditation. And the other thing I was thinking of is proriasis. I didn't know if you had any special association with that particular word, usually translated as character or will, in terms of conforming our wills to the will of nature, which is something I see in the Gita too, I don't know.
Yeah, no, that is a great point. So, and Lou is right. So I'm glad you continued on that topic. That what the Gita would say is that, like, our desires are not really what is important. What's important is that duty which is done according to the dharma. So again, we come back to karma and dharma concept. And
Yeah.
and likewise, sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry. I thought of one more question, then I'll be quiet. The other thing I was seeing in this last paper I was working on about Epictetus is the degree to which he emphasizes that we are never able to judge others' behavior because we have not got a sense of what the intention of the other is. So I think that's very important. I didn't know if, a lot of people look for advice giving as being a kind of panacea for what we should do. But Epictetus is very clear about that it is in principle impossible because we cannot know the intention of the other. So we have to withhold judgment from others.
Yeah, that is true. And I love how Epictetus can just, communicate it so briefly and in a compact way and just absolutely to the fullest value. So Seneca has given some examples where he says that, wise men would not say that you copy my behavior and think that that's the right thing to do. He says that the situation might be different, the intent might be different, or the influence and the consequences would be different too. So in every situation, you have to really put your knowledge and wisdom to use and decide what is the right thing to do. So it's not so much about desire, it's about what is your duty at that point and what is the right thing to do. So the constant question you're asking yourself is what is the right thing to do? And then, do you have the capacity to implement it? Because sometimes people think one example I gave in my book is let's say if there's a blind man on a busy road who wants to cross the road, and there are three people. First one thinks it's a good idea to have the blind man, but he or she doesn't have time. The second one can't do it because he or she is afraid of crossing the road on their own. And the third person both knows that it's a good idea to help this person cross the road and knows how to do it. So it's not like everybody has the virtue that they can implement. But if you have the wisdom and have the virtue, then at the end of crossing the road, they have the sense of accomplishment that they have done the right thing and they have helped somebody. Does that answer your question?
I'd like to add to the thing, the emphasis on remembrance. You know, in Sanskrit, it's smriti. In the Pali, that the Buddhists use it sati. And this is sometimes translated as not just mindfulness, but as a kind of recollection or remembrance, which is kind of like anamnesis a little bit or something like that. So there's that element that, and that term means meditative practice in some of these traditions. And then the other term that Massimo Pigliucci, popularizer of Stoicism today, emphasizes a lot is prosoch or prosoke. I'm not so sure how to pronounce it, which means something like attentiveness, which is similar to remembrance. Like really just this insistence on doing what you said, Ashwini, which is really just paying attention to all the factors present in any decision-making process, right? And before acting and while acting and then reflecting on, like this is the key. And this is kind of like mindfulness. It's at least the opposite of mindlessness, which is something that I always like to say. Especially, that's one of my responses to people who have this criticism of this widespread secular use of mindfulness, which has become kind of commodified and what do they call it? McMindfulness, like McDonald's, right? It's so cheap, like McYoga. Everybody has a yoga mat, and they're not really yogis, you know. All they do is these postures. They're doing body sculpting, so it's McYoga, right? But I think it's still a good thing, and this is an argument that I make. I'm just taking advantage of I'm abusing the fact that I'm the moderator here to share one of my ideas. Even if all the McMindfulness practitioners are doing it for the wrong reasons, if they're increasing their mindfulness at all, in this sense, if they're decreasing mindlessness even a little, that's a good thing for everybody. That's my argument in favor of McMindfulness. All right, so I don't want to capitalize the floor here. Did you want to come back with anything, Patricia, about this? Because you brought a lot up that might not have been addressed, or...
Right. I had one more question. I didn't know if you do anything or if you find similar understandings. You're talking about the Gita. I wondered, how about the Dhammapada?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if I had the time, I took 10 years to write this book, and one of my desires was to also include Buddhism as a third leg of comparison. But at the end of the 10 years, my university said to me, this is it, either you submit it or don't. But yes, there are a lot of parallels. Yeah, for the future, or maybe for somebody else's future.
Yeah, the parallels are very great there. Of course, so are the differences. They're great too.
Yeah.
So,
well, I want to thank Rick and Lou. It's been absolutely wonderful getting back in touch with this group. And I'm sorry I've stayed away for some time because Oxford or UK doesn't really have a lot of practice here. And I got busy with my research work, so, wasn't able to focus on philosophical counseling. But I'm just so proud that all of you continue to do this with great zeal and enthusiasm.
Yeah, we still have a little time left if you're not too sleepy. I know it's late for you, but if there's anybody else who has a question.
If you have...
Yeah, Rick, may I?
Yeah, please, Lou.
I had a couple of questions, Ashwini. I
Great.
mean, you touched on a lot of things, but I did want to ask you, I mean, just in passing, where in London were you? You said you were studying in London for a year. Where in London?
I was at King's College in London.
You were at King's. Oh, in which department?
Greek philosophy department.
great. That's wonderful. I was at UCL,
Okay.
so just not far away. And King's
No,
has
no.
also a great philosophy
Yeah,
department.
it
You
is. Yeah.
probably know. So that's really nice. There is something, I don't know if you touched on it in your book, which I have to confess I haven't yet read, although I think it's on my shelves in English. I'm not capable of reading the Hindi version, not yet. Next life maybe. But did you consider? Did you touch on, there is one Stoic meditation, I think that's very much in concert with the Gita, and that's the idea of overcoming death, the fear of death, and of course for different reasons, because of course the Gita has soul theory behind it, and Seneca not necessarily. Nonetheless, they do have cemetery meditations, right, in Stoicism. The idea of being more similar maybe to Buddhism, but have you touched on that theme at all?
I do talk a little bit about death,
Yeah,
but
remembering death, the importance of
yeah.
being aware of the possibility of death. I remember reading that in your book.
Oh, thank you, Rick. But not as much. Well, actually, if I look at the bibliography here, there are more than 20 references to death. So I'll have to go back and remind myself.
As it ought to be. Well, you've answered my question, because I can pull your book off my
Okay.
shelves in English now and check the index. So that will be great. I'm going to do it.
Yeah. Well,
And
I'm very
another thing,
flattered. Do you have a copy?
well, I think I have. Listen, I have accumulated so many books in, the last 18 years or so, that I'm having to now either build more bookshelves or find a bigger home. I'm not sure which. I'm not yet ready to give books away. I know that some people, and I have senior colleagues who've reached a stage in life where they start giving books away, and I'm kind of I'm not attached to giving my books away. I'm more attached to collecting, but there's a balance point there. Anyway, Ashwini, another thing, since you're very forthcoming about your interests, and Rick has also contributed, his anecdote about having difficulty finding a PhD supervision. I had the same problem as well, and I think anybody who wants to do something original is bound to have this problem in the academy, and I think it's a very good problem to have. And whatever you had to say about courage, you need courage to go your own way and
Yeah.
still, end up being successful. So that takes some exceptional effort, not necessarily diplomacy, but
Well, thank you.
very,
No,
very
in
good on you that you managed to do that. So what about
thank you.
Spinoza? I just wanted to throw that name out to ask if you've thought about him at all, and what your future projects are. Do you have anything planned? Are you working on something new, or are you turning a leaf of any kind? And if so,
Yeah.
is Spinoza at all in your thoughts? Because he's someone I think who perhaps meets Indian philosophy and Stoicism halfway in his own way, in terms of making one's mind conformable to nature, right?
Yeah, so I guess Spinoza is somebody that that sort of like fell in the list of people who have been influenced by the Gita, because I was just doing a survey work for an article about how many continents, how many philosophies have been influenced by the Gita, and how many European philosophers and how many Indian philosophers, and the list is really so astonishing. I mean, at a point it seemed endless, but there are some very, very major philosophers. And, people always ask me when I publish my book, like, do you know any historical evidence of whether they were like, sort of actual exchanges of thoughts? And one example that would come up is the silk trade, and like, how the ideas were carried through merchants. And those days, even the merchants knew about philosophy. So all those things are true. So I haven't actually spent much time on Spinoza or Hegel, to be honest, which I would love to do. But I kind of launched into Indian philosophy for the last few years. And in fact, one of my projects is very close to what Rick has been working on, which is meditation and mysticism. And I'm really hoping to finish that, because I've kind of gotten lulled into this idea that you can take a decade and still sit on your research without publishing. And, I really want to finish that and publish it. as soon
Right.
as possible.
Well, that's great,
And
and we look forward to hearing more about, your research as you expand. But I got to tell you, Rick
yeah,
knows this.
yeah,
And
we'd love to.
I just wrote for Lydia a chapter on the influence of Asian philosophy on the West, and discovered, and I hadn't known this, but Spinoza couldn't have known. He fortuitously discovered things, I think, that are findable in Indian philosophy and in Buddhism. But it turns out that the first English translation of the Bhagavad-Gita was 1775 or thereabouts, by Charles Wilkins, who was working for the East India Company and was commissioned by Warren Hastings to do it. But then it ended up in the library of Emerson's father. So Ralph Waldo Emerson read this book in his father's library, and that's how he found it. And then, of course, that's how Thoreau found it. He borrowed Emerson's copy and took it around the pond and read it. So we have that very important influence on the New England idealists, and that's
Yeah,
something that you could pick up on if you wanted to, right? I mean, it's very.
yeah,
And then it turns out that John Adams found out about this as well. And he was saying that he thought, because these people were fairly, I'm using the word progressive in the 18th century context, not the 21st. So they were progressive in the sense of wanting to free themselves of biases that were received in the culture. And John Adams said, and I have a quote from him somewhere, saying he wanted more dissemination of the Bhagavad Gita in English because he thought it would shake people out of their prejudices, which is absolutely fascinating, is it not?
yeah. This is great that you have stories to go with that as well. I didn't know all these stories, but I was actually, as I said, like working on the survey of the influence of the Gita, and all those names popped up.
Well, it's great, and maybe you'll in the future make more connections. Part of your own work could be to connect the Gita to other Western traditions and beyond
Yeah, I hope
Stoicism,
so.
including the American philosophical traditions, maybe even pragmatism. Who knows? But it's really nice to
Yeah,
see you
sure.
again, and I'm glad that you're
Thank
thriving in
you.
Oxford. That's a wonderful thing.
Likewise, thank you. So, do we have more questions on the chat? I something coming up.
One from Patricia. She's going to Pondicherry soon and was wondering if you could connect her somehow or another to philosophical counselors there. I think that was her question.
Oh, yeah, Bala
I
would
told
be
her
the
to speak to
perfect
Bala, and I
person.
gave her Bala's email already.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
mean, this is not a secret.
and
Just Google people, and you'll pull up all
yeah,
their.
and I have a book here, which is by Aurobindo.
Ah.
Yeah, that's where the
Yeah, so
ashram is.
Aurobindo
Yeah,
also did some
Pondicherry.
work. Yeah, yeah. I mean, he was an absolutely great man, great scholar, great saint.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. And since you mentioned Bala, Rick, if I could throw in a plug for the next Agora, because we're alternating. Rick and I are doing book club 1 month in Agora. Bala is we're celebrating Indian philosophy again this spring, and in April on the 28th we'll have Professor Balaganapathy Devarakonda as our featured guest on the APPA Agora.
And we
But
had
have a
Samir. We had Samir back in December.
Yeah, we
So
had
it's,
Samir, but that was anxiety. We're free of that now. The thing is, though, that we have you're in Oxford, and that's very, very friendly for us regarding the time difference, which is now only 4 hours. But
Yeah,
there is no way to solve this problem between New York and
yeah,
Delhi.
Delhi.
true.
So we are doing it at 8:30 p.m. here, which is 7 a.m. in India on the Monday, and that was
Oh,
the earliest. I mean, Bala was gung ho about getting up in the morning, but not in the middle of the night. So
yeah,
to give Bala a break, we're going to start at 8:30 p.m. Well, that's great for the folks on the west coast of the U.S.
yeah.
and
Or
not
you
too
could do it
bad.
in the morning,
But
like
for
then
you,
I
it's going to
can
be
jump
the
in.
Europeans are going to be, caught in the middle of the night. There was no time zone that was going to work for everybody, so we accommodated
Okay,
Allah. But anyway, that will be next month.
okay. Yeah,
And
keep
if
me on
you
your
and
list, and I would
Patricia,
love
you
to
should
attend.
definitely. I mean, we have lots of friends in India who are doing philosophical counseling, and you'll be able to meet many of them when you go. Sure. And also, I think that Bala is coming to. Well, he said he is, and I'm not confirming, but he espoused the intention to go to Zagreb in June for the next ICPP, and actually maybe to volunteer really to host the next one in Delhi, which we think would be great. Then we'll all meet up in India again, which would be fantastic. Yeah, so that's right. We hope he comes in to Zagreb, and we hope he proposes that the University of Delhi will host the next one, which would be phenomenal.
That sounds great.
And we'll hope to see you there too, Ashwini. I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah, me
you know,
too. Yeah,
if
we
we can
never.
lure you out of, I mean, Oxford is, such an ancient seat of contemplation. I know what people in Oxford tend to stay there. Uh,
Yeah,
maybe
true.
we, right?
Because everybody comes to visit here, and all I have to do is just stay put.
Yeah.
I feel bad. Alexander just showed up a little while ago. I think it was the time change. We changed our clocks, so you missed it, Alexander. But when Lou is done editing this and posting it on YouTube, you'll be able to find it on the APPA YouTube channel, so you could see what you missed then. But if you have any questions, by all means, we have a
No,
couple more minutes here.
no, but yes, that was a problem. I didn't know on time was changed. So yeah, it was because of that I was late. I'm sorry.
I figured that. Yeah, sorry. I should have emailed everybody a reminder about the time change. This happens. Yeah, it happened to me the other day. I run a Friday morning 9 a.m. meditation thing online, and some people showed up an hour late. All right, well, if there are no other questions, Ashwini, we always like to give our guests the last word. So if you want to repeat what you're working on, or what, where we can find you, your blog, anything like that, or whatever you like, anything you didn't get to say and might want to say, the floor is yours until we close. And thank you.
Well, thank you so much. It's really been a pleasure once again, meeting all of you again, and you're keeping this alive. And I still continue to write on philosophical counseling or give talks. So if anybody wants to invite me, I'd be more than happy to go talk to them. I also have a blog, and the name is very original. It's called ashwinimokashi.com. So you don't need to wonder. And I keep posting a lot of my new work over there. I also publish my spiritual philosophy articles in a journal called Pathway to God, and it's published out of Belgavi in India, which is where ACPR, or Academia of Comparative Philosophy and Religion, is based.
Great. Well, there was one little request in the chat just now, and it said, for anyone who's not familiar with Indian philosophy, what texts would you recommend other than the Bhagavad-Gita? And Lou
So I
apparently
guess,
is taking this person's address. Maybe he's going to send her a syllabus or something.
yeah, that would be very helpful. He probably has a long list.
Oh,
But
yes. So do I. But just off the top of your head, maybe just one. What's the most important text other than the Gita that a newbie might want to read?
I would say start with Max Miller's philosophy of history of Indian philosophy,
History.
and then go to the actual text, because unless they know Sanskrit, it might be difficult. Even reading translations don't always make sense if you don't have any idea about the language.
Yeah, that's a good idea. History of Indian philosophy. Also, Radhakrishnan has a couple of good books overviewing
Yeah.
Sarvapalli
Yeah.
Radhakrishnan, overviewing
Radhakrishnan
Indian
as well,
philosophy. Yeah.
Yeah, and I would highly see that, Percy Ranade, whose book I showed you earlier, has written a lot of books. He's a very prolific Indian philosophy writer. He's also written a book on history of Indian philosophy, which is very thick and very big. And it's written along with Professor Belwalkar. And he has a very small book, which is like in notes format regarding Indian philosophy.
Yeah,
So
there's just so much. Indian philosophy is so rich and
yeah,
very
it is
varied. Yeah.
extremely rich. And if you
The-
come
the-
to Oxford, there's a room full of all the Samhitas and Vedas and Puranas and all chapters of Mahabharata, and they're all in Sanskrit. So you can spend your lifetime there in that room.
I can imagine. Elizabeth said, I lived in India, but realized there's so much more that it is hard to know where to go from a Western perspective. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yes, it is.
right.
Well, we just gave her
As it
some
does.
clues. And Lou is probably going to email her some more.
I will.
That-
I'll
yeah.
send her I'll send her a short bibliography. And it doesn't, I mean, Rick, you know, and Ashwini, you know, I don't think it matters where you start because it's like the ocean, you know, it all tastes the same wherever you step into it. So as long as you step into it, you will experience it in some beneficial way.
Yeah, you know what?
Yeah. True. I mean, it takes a long time to get a good handle over, over the entire umbrella of Indian philosophy.
At lifetimes, but there's no rush, right?
Yeah.
Sarah, if you're still here, turn your camera on. I'm going to take a quick picture of everybody. If not, well, okay, great. Ready, set. How do we do this? I keep forgetting.
Shift print screen, I think.
Yeah, yeah,
Function,
yeah, yeah.
function
No, I
print
have a
screen.
Mac. I got it. I
Oh,
got
you
it.
got a Mac. I have
Ready, everybody smile. Okay. All right, thank you.
Thank
I could have
you.
always done that later, but yeah. Thank you so much, Ashwini. It was great having you here.
Thank
Good to
you.
see
Thanks
you
a lot.
again. I'm so happy that we did this because when you were living in New Jersey, you tried several times to connect with me because that's where I live and we never pulled it off. Oh, Patricia, you have something? Oh, you're muted.
This is not interesting, but I was hoping that Lou would reiterate the date in April for the next Agora.
It's not a secret. It's on APPA's website, front
Okay.
and center. All you need is APPA's website.
Oh,
and
yes. And that
revealed.
reminds me, Lou asked me to tell everybody, once you register for one of these book club or Agora events, you're on the list for that permanently until you ask us to take your name off.
I
So you
think
don't have to
everyone.
keep, yeah, you don't have to keep registering.
Oh, I think everyone here knows this, but we have some people sign up every month and they never show up. So listen, this is what, you know, it's public, okay?
Yeah, then we have to remove the duplicates, this kind of thing.
But anyway, Patricia, it's April 28th, and you know, to be official, but it's on the website and we'll look forward to seeing you again.
Thank you.
Rick, this was great. Ashwini, it was great. Thank you. So nice to
Thank
see you
you.
again.
Thank you.
All right, folks, everybody have a great rest of the day, rest of the evening, Ashwini.
Thank you. Same to
Take
you.
care.
Bye-bye.
Ciao.
Bye-bye.